They called it Corpsewood Manor, a name born from dead trees and gothic whimsy, whispered through the pines of Taylor Ridge like an unholy hymn. It wasn't just a house, it was a handmade fortress of eccentricity, nestled deep in the backwoods of North Georgia, where brick walls held no insulation and strange sigils glared from stained glass like watchful eyes. To the locals, it was the home of two devil worshippers, a castle of sin where wine flowed like blood and forbidden pleasures curled in the dark. To its owners, Dr. Charles Scudder and Joseph Odom, it was a refuge from judgment, a dream carved out of isolation and earth, a sanctuary far from the reach of society's scorn. But dreams, when misread by the cruel or the ignorant, can become nightmares. On a bitter December night in 1982, that dream was shattered by 4 gunshots, then 5 more. A harp, gold-leafed and silent, watched as its master fell. 2 loyal mastiffs died trying to protect him. When the killers fled into the shadows, they left behind not just a scene of unspeakable violence, but something else, something colder than blood and quieter than death. What happened at Corpsewood was more than murder. It was an exorcism of the unwanted, cloaked in bigotry and greed, and in its aftermath, the land itself would not rest. The manor burned. The bricks refused to stay quiet. Those who returned spoke of eyes in the forest, phantom howls, and music with no source. This is the true story of Corpsewood Manor, a tale of sanctuary turned slaughterhouse, of men hunted for who they were, of murder that bred myth, and perhaps something beyond myth. The facts are real, the horror is undeniable, and the dead, some say that they never left. In December 1982, a gruesome double murder in rural North Georgia shocked the nation. Dr. Charles Scudder, a retired university professor, and his partner, Joseph "Joey" Odom, were found brutally slain at their hand-built home, an isolated brick mini-castle that they called Corpsewood Manor. The murders and the bizarre circumstances surrounding the crime scene quickly became the stuff of local legend. To this day, the tale of Corpsewood Manor haunts Chattooga County, a blend of true crime horror and whispered paranormal folklore. It's a story of 2 eccentric men seeking peace amid a violent end, a pair of drifters driven by greed and hate, and a crime scene so lurid that it fed tabloid headlines about devil worship and sparked ghost stories that linger for decades. Dr. Charles Lee Scudder was an accomplished scientist and academic before he ever set foot in the Georgia woods. Born in 1926, Scudder earned a PhD in pharmacology and spent over a decade as an associate professor at Loyola University in Chicago. By the late 1970s, however, he had grown disillusioned with urban life and academia. He was weary of university politics, the chaos of the city, and what he perceived as the moral decay around him. Scudder had also undergone personal changes. He had been married, fathering 4 sons, and divorced. And by 1959, he had met Joseph Odom, a gentle soul 12 years his junior, who originally worked as Scudder's housekeeper and cook. Over time, Scudder and Odom became devoted companions and lovers. Seeking a simpler, more fulfilling life together, the pair dreamed of leaving Chicago's turmoil behind and retreating somewhere quiet, remote, and open-minded enough to tolerate two openly gay men. Scudder's vision of an idyllic sanctuary was vividly described in a Mother Earth news article he wrote. He longed for some place in hilly country, with the glamour of 4 seasons, but without super cold winters, and with a good supply of pure water and wood for heating, and most importantly, with a measure of isolation. On his 50th birthday in October 1976, Dr. Scudder turned that dream into a reality. He resigned from his faculty position, auctioned off most of his posh belongings, and shed modern conveniences, even giving away all of his appliances in preparation for an off-grid life. With a modest inheritance from his mother's recent passing, Scudder purchased a 40-acre wooded tract on Taylor's Ridge in Chattooga County, Georgia. That winter, he and Odom packed their 2 beloved English Mastiff dogs into a Jeep and drove south through a blizzard to their new home site. The journey was arduous. They lost their way in the Appalachian foothills and even camped in a tent amid a snowstorm. But when the skies cleared, they beheld an otherworldly scene of bare, bone-white trees on the ridge. The abundance of leafless, lifeless trees looked like corpses, inspiring the macabre name Corpsewood for their homestead. Charles Scudder and Joey Odom set out to build their own little castle in the wilderness, entirely by hand. They lived out of a cramped camper as they broke ground on the new house in early 1977. With determination and labor, the couple spent roughly 2 years laying 45,000 bricks, one by one, to construct a 2-story brick home with walls 3 layers thick. Scudder drew up unconventional plans inspired by medieval architecture. In fact, there are no square corners in the whole place. An investigator later remarked of the oddly rounded, turret-like design. The first floor, finished by the end of summer of 1977, contained a kitchen, dining room, and living area. By the next year, the second floor, 2 cozy bedrooms, reached by a circular staircase, lit by stained glass windows, was topped with a roof. They dug a deep well and built a small brick pump house for it, installed a wood-burning stove for heat, and erected a brick outhouse for a chemical toilet. All of this was achieved with no electricity and using only hand tools, truly living off the grid long before it was trendy. From the outset, Scudder's flair for the occult and dramatic was embedded in Corpsewood's design. He crowned the arched front entrance with a leering pink gargoyle statue made of concrete, a guardian demon watching over the door. Inside, he crafted stained glass windows depicting a human skull and the goat-headed Baphomet, an emblem of the Church of Satan. Scudder was indeed an official member of Anton LaVey's Church of Satan, an atheist philosophy rather than a literal devil-worshipping one. And his new home was filled with arcane and unsettling decor. He kept human skulls from his days in medical research. A black and gold statue of the demon Mephistopheles stood on display, and each of the manor's 4 brick chimneys was adorned with an inverted pentagram symbol. Life at Corpsewood Manor was deliberately primitive, which gave the place an even more gothic atmosphere. The manor had no electricity, no phone, and no plumbing. At night, The couple relied on oil lamps and candles that cast dancing shadows across the walls, decorated with occult artwork. A wood stove in the kitchen provided heat and a place to cook the vegetables that they grew in their garden. Odom tended a small rose garden out front and a patch of muscadine grapevines out back for making homemade wine. By day, the two men tended to a menagerie of animals and projects on their land. Besides their two mastiffs, aptly named Beelzebub and Arsenoth, they kept chickens and even built a small lake, orchard, and apiary over time. In a 1981 letter, Scudder described an idyllic daily routine at Corpsewood. At 10 a.m., we had tea in the gazebo. Tonight, I may practice my harp, or perhaps I'll sit in the courtyard and listen to the tree frogs and whippoorwills while bats fly and clouds drift across the full moon. The world that's around me now is fresh, quiet, and very beautiful. Indeed, Scudder brought a lavish gold leaf harp to this wilderness and often played music under the stars, adding to the site's otherworldly aura. Beyond the main house, Scudder and Odom erected several outbuildings, including a 3-story brick chicken coop that would gain infamy and local lore. The first floor of this structure housed their poultry and stored food. The second floor held supplies and reportedly part of the couple's extensive pornography collection. The top floor was painted entirely in a rosy hue and decked out as a den of pleasures, soon known as the Pink Room. Inside this loft space were mattresses draped in pink, candles, and lanterns for light. Assorted whips and chains hung on the walls, and a logbook for visitors to sign in. This was Scudder and Odom's private retreat for entertaining guests, a secluded loft where they offered guests homemade wine, marijuana, and an escape from prying eyes. Locals whispered that sexual parties took place in the Pink Room, and indeed, Scudder did not hide his free-spirited sexuality. The pair were not monogamous, and Scudder was known to correspond with pen pals, including prison inmates, about erotic interests, even keeping notes on various lovers' kinks. Rumors later claimed that the Pink Room's guest book contained names of up to 300 visitors, including supposedly some prominent local men, though the ledger mysteriously vanished during the murder investigation. Whether or not local VIPs indulged in Corpsewood's offerings, such rumors only fueled the dark legend that grew around the place. Despite their quest for seclusion, Scudder and Odom did not entirely shun the outside world. They frequently drove their black Jeep into the tiny town of Tryon for groceries and supplies. Their vehicle turned heads. It was emblazoned with occult symbols, including a large pentacle on the side. In the conservative rural South of the early 1980s, this alone caused a stir. Townsfolk began to gossip about the two peculiar devil worshippers living up on the ridge. Whispers spread of satanic rituals, orgies in a pleasure castle, and other lurid imaginings. Some locals used homophobic slurs, referring to Scudder and Odom as the queer devil worshippers on the mountain. Yet those who actually met the men often came away with a different impression. By all accounts, Scudder and Odom were friendly and accommodating to curious folk and wandering deer hunters. The couple did not brandish weapons or threaten trespassers. They welcomed neighbors and adventurers alike, with flasks of their potent homemade wine and marijuana joints by the fire. One of those visitors was Kenneth Avery Brock, a local teenager who stumbled onto Corpsewood Manor while hunting deer in the woods in 1982. Brock was 17 years old, a high school dropout doing odd jobs, and he had heard the fearful whispers about the gay devil worshippers on Taylor's Ridge. But curiosity got the better of him. When he encountered Dr. Scudder on a hunting foray, the professor turned homesteader greeted him warmly. Scudder even gave Brock permission to hunt on the property and invited him to the Pink Room for a taste of homemade muscadine wine and conversation. By Brock's later account, these visits turned sexual, and then he returned several times for intimate encounters with the men. At the time, the age of consent in Georgia was just 14, but sodomy, even between consenting adults, was still illegal. Brock's secret liaisons with the two men would have been scandalous if revealed, and he reportedly kept them hidden from his friends. Nonetheless, his experiences at Corpsewood planted a seed in his mind, one that would soon grow into a deadly plot. In the fall of 1982, Kenneth Avery Brock moved into a trailer home in the nearby Halls Valley with a new roommate, Samuel Tony West, age 30. West was considerably older than Brock and had a far more troubled past. Hailing from the same area, West had spent much of his life in and out of prisons and mental institutions. In fact, his criminal history was already littered with violence. Chillingly, West's career in crime had begun years earlier when he shot and killed his own 2-year-old nephew in what was described as an execution-style murder. He had also been implicated in other serious crimes over the years. By 1982, Tony West was an unemployed ex-con living in a rundown trailer, a volatile man described as wild and prone to bouts of cruelty by those who knew him. Brock, drifting and aimless, became West's roommate and an unlikely friend. It wasn't long before young Brock told West all about the oddball couple living up on Taylor's Ridge. In Brock's telling, Corpsewood Manor must have sounded like a tempting target. He spun tales of rich Satanists who dwelt in a remote brick mansion filled with antiques, who drank fine wine, and most importantly, who Brock believed were hiding a fortune somewhere in the walls of their house. Brock had seen enough to tantalize him. Scudder's gold-encrusted harp, valuable-looking artwork and furniture, and perhaps even vials of LSD and drugs that might fetch a price. And indeed, Scudder kept a supply of LSD, old lab samples, on hand, though it turns out they were mostly inert. Neither Brock nor West had much money to their names, and the prospect of robbing the couple promised a windfall beyond their wildest dreams. So in the privacy of that trailer, the two men began to plan. As West later admitted to investigators, they planned the crime days in advance. They would gain entry under friendly pretenses, then subdue the victims, torture them if necessary, and force them to reveal where their money and treasures were hidden. Brock even attempted a reconnaissance mission in November of 1982. He visited Corpsewood several times that month, ostensibly to socialize, but with an ulterior motive of learning the layout of the house and where valuables might be kept. However, Scudder and Odom never let the teenager inside the main house beyond the vestibule. All of Brock's interactions took place in outdoor areas or in the pink room loft. He remained largely unaware that the brick mansion had no safe full of cash, no electricity, which might have tipped him off that high-value electronics or appliances were absent, and in fact, there was very little money on the site at all. The homesteaders lived simply on about $200 a month, with any savings kept in a local bank. Brock's imagination, fueled by town gossip and youthful greed, filled in the blanks with fantasies of hidden riches. Frustrated by his limited knowledge of the interior, Brock and West decided that they would simply have to storm Corpsewood Manor and find the loot by force. They prepared weapons and tools for the deed. Brock borrowed a .22 caliber Remington rifle from his mother under the ruse of needing it to hunt rabbits. West, meanwhile, mixed up a batch of homebrew intoxicant called Toodaloo, a noxious cocktail of alcohol, paint thinner, and glue, huffed to produce a cheap high. On December 12th of 1982, the conspirators set their plan into motion. They invited two teenagers, Joey Wells, West's 18-year-old nephew, and his girlfriend, Teresa Hudgens, both of whom were unaware of the plot, to ride along with them under the pretense of a casual double date. Brock and West suggested they all drive up into the mountains to visit those folks at Corpsewood for some homemade wine, a proposition which sounded harmless enough to the teens, though Teresa was uneasy about visiting devil worshippers, but she was eventually coaxed into it. The four loaded into West's car, bringing along the rifle, a jug of Toodaloo, and a couple of empty wine flasks. They rumbled up the winding dirt road, and formerly known as Dead Horse Road, toward Corpsewood Manor as dusk fell. As they neared the property, Teresa later recalled seeing the rifle wedged between the front two seats, an ominous sign that something was amiss. Charles Scudder and Joey Odom were relaxing on that chilly Sunday evening, unaware of the danger that approached them. Earlier, Odom had prepared a chicken dinner, and the couple likely spent the early night in routine, perhaps listening to music or reading by lamplight. They had no telephone and no electricity, so surprise visitors were not uncommon and usually welcomed. Sometime after dark, the sound of car tires crunching up the leaf-strewn drive announced the arrival of guests. Dr. Scudder stepped outside to greet the unexpected guests. He even bummed a cigarette from the young men to take inside to Joey Odom, who was tidying up the kitchen after supper. The group explained that they were just out joyriding and thought that they'd stop by. Being the ever-gracious host that he was, Scudder invited all four visitors to climb the 40-foot ladder up to the pink room for some plum wine and conversation. He had no reason to suspect anything sinister. Brock was a familiar face by now, and the presence of a young woman likely put the couple further at ease. Up in the drafty pink room, illuminated by a single kerosene lantern and a propane heater, Scudder poured glasses of his homemade muscadine wine for everyone. Brock passed around a plastic bag of the Toodaloo cocktail, which Teresa and Joey Wells sniffed, though Dr. Scudder himself politely declined the huffing in favor of sipping wine. The gathering must have seemed surreal. 5 people huddled in a dimly lit attic loft, painted Pepto-Bismol pink, surrounded by whips and eccentric bric-a-brac with the winter wind howling outside. For a few minutes, they engaged in small talk, and Scudder's 2 English mastiffs barked occasionally down below, uneasy at the unfamiliar commotion. Perhaps to break the ice, Scudder played host in his quirky way by showing off some pornography and making jokes. Any semblance of normalcy, however, was short-lived. After 15 or 20 minutes, Kenneth Brock excused himself, saying that he needed to go down to the car to get more party drink. He clambered down the ladder back into the cold night. In truth, this was the moment that he and West had been waiting for. Their ambush was about to begin. Brock retrieved the loaded .22 caliber rifle from the vehicle and returned to the base of the ladder. When the young man emerged again through the trap door in the pink room, armed with the rifle, Dr. Scudder's eyes caught the glint of the gun barrel. Incredibly, Scudder laughed, perhaps thinking that it was a prank. The gray-haired professor calmly joked, "Bang, bang," as if playing cops and robbers. His relaxed reaction, maybe born of intoxication or disbelief, momentarily threw Brock off guard. But Tony West, eyes blazing, pulled out a knife. In a flash, Brock lunged at Scudder, yanking the slight 50-year-old man by his long gray hair, while West pressed the knife blade hard against Scudder's throat. At this moment, any illusion of a harmless visit evaporated. Teresa Hudgens let out a scream, and Joey Wells froze in terror. West barked orders, shoving Scudder's face down and binding his hands with a rope. The attackers demanded that Scudder tell them where the money was. Though startled and roughed up, Scudder remained eerily calm. He insisted that there was no fortune hidden here. The house held no cash and only a few valuables, that their modest funds were all kept in a bank account instead. Not believing him, Brock grew agitated. He decided to force Joey Odom to hand over money instead. Brock clambered back down the ladder, shouting for Odom to come out of the main house with the dogs. Frightened, Teresa and Joey Wells saw their chance and bolted down the ladder as well, hoping to run to the car. But Tony West chased after them, catching the teens before they could escape. At gunpoint, he corralled them back, even attempting to start the getaway car himself at one point. But the car stalled, leaving them no choice but to drag the trembling teenagers back up into the loft as hostages. Meanwhile, at the foot of the ladder, Kenneth Brock was already kicking in the kitchen door of the manor. Joey Odom heard the commotion and his lover's distant voice, and had unlatched the door to see what was happening. He was greeted by the muzzle of Brock's .22 rifle. Without hesitation, Brock opened fire. A crack of gunfire then echoed throughout the trees. Odom was struck multiple times and crumpled to the floor of the kitchen. Brock then turned the rifle on the 2 mastiffs, shooting both dogs at point-blank range as they cowered by the wood stove. The loyal mastiffs that had been the pride of Corpsewood now lay dying alongside Odom. In the pink room above, West and the teens heard the gunshots ring out in quick succession. Teresa later said that it was a barrage of bullets, and then a terrible silence. West forced the bound Scudder and the two shocked teenagers down the ladder, and then marched them at gunpoint toward the main house. It was a chaotic scene. The once cozy home now had a bullet-riddled door, blood splattered on the walls, and the smell of gunpowder and death in the air. Joey Odom, though mortally wounded, was still clinging to life on the kitchen floor, and he had managed to drag himself a short distance, smearing blood across the stone tiles. Charles Scudder's eyes fell on the horrifying sight of his partner sprawled in blood. The professor's composure finally cracked. He lurched forward, muffling a cry through the gag that West had shoved over his mouth. West ripped the gag off and again demanded, "Where's the damn money?" He also snarled to Brock to fetch a soldering iron from the tools, apparently intending to torture Scudder for information. Scudder, even now, managed a dark quip. "We don't have electricity out here, so what good would a soldering iron do?" Enraged at the defiance, West threatened more violence. In that moment, Dr. Scudder looked around at the carnage. His lifelong partner dying, their beloved dogs slain, their dream home violated, and he spoke quietly. "I asked for this," he said, cryptically. Perhaps those words reflected regret for inviting these dangerous young men into his haven, or regret for moving to a place where such intolerance festered. Those would be his final words. Scudder made a desperate lunge toward Joey Odom's prone body, reaching out to comfort his partner, even as West aimed the gun. A shot exploded from West's rifle, and Dr. Scudder fell, a bullet wound searing through his face. Incredibly, Scudder did not die instantly. Despite a severe wound, the 50-year-old man was still moving, stubbornly attempting to crawl toward Odom. Brock and West stood over him and coldly fired 4 more rounds into Scudder's head at close range. At last, Dr. Charles Scudder lay still, his blood pooling onto the floor near his cherished library of occult books and the fallen Christmas tree. The castle in the woods had truly become a corpse wood, its keepers now corpses within its walls. In a grim stroke of irony, hanging on the wall not far from Scudder's body was a self-portrait that he had painted of himself some months earlier. In the painting, Scudder depicted himself bound and gagged, and with 5 bleeding bullet wounds in his head. It was as if the scene now playing out had been foretold on the canvas, an eerie premonition realized in blood. Even the killers would later remark on the spooky accuracy of that artwork, its paint now flecked with the very gore it predicted. Joey Odom was still gasping weakly, terribly wounded, but not yet dead. Brock approached the crawling man and ended Odom's life with a final point-blank gunshot, executing him on the spot. The brutal deed was done. In only a few explosive minutes, the quiet of the Georgia woods had given way to gunfire and screams, and 2 innocent men, along with their dogs, had been slaughtered in their own sanctuary. The terrified teen witnesses, Joey Wells and Teresa Hudgens, huddled together in shock, weeping and begging for their lives. Brock and West spared them but only because they might prove useful and could be intimidated into silence. With Scudder and Odom dead, the intruders ransacked Corpsewood Manor in a frenzy. They tore through drawers, flipped mattresses, and pried at floorboards, desperately searching for cash and valuables. They found almost nothing of the riches that they had imagined. In the end, the murderers grabbed a handful of personal items, a few pieces of jewelry, a gold-plated ceremonial dagger, a couple of silver candlesticks, a pistol, and a leather jacket. They also eyed Dr. Scudder's big harp, perhaps the single most valuable item in the house, and even lugged it out to the car, but it proved too large to fit into the vehicle. Frustration and disappointment set in as it dawned on them that there was no hidden fortune. This whole massacre had been for a few meager trinkets. Time was running out before someone might come along, so the men decided to flee. They forced Teresa and Joey Wells back into their own car and left the crime scene in shambles. Crimson blood splashed across the manor's brick walls and bookshelves. Outside, West issued a chilling warning to the teens. If they told anyone what had happened here, he would kill them too. In fact, according to later reports, Teresa was essentially held hostage by the extended Wells family for the next several days. They were terrified that if she went to the police, West might return and harm them all. Brock and West then transferred their stolen goods into Dr. Scudder's black Jeep. The killers decided to use the victim's own vehicle for their getaway, since West's car was not running reliably since it had stalled earlier. They started the Jeep and barreled off down the mountain, leaving Corpsewood Manor littered with bodies, bullet casings, and spilled wine. In their haste, they had abandoned some incriminating evidence. Notably, West had left behind his bloody knife, and Brock his rifle, the stock of which had broken during the assaults. But any concerns about covering their tracks were secondary to escape. Brock and West drove through the night, heading westward out of Georgia. Their fanciful plan was to flee to Mexico, far from the reach of Southern justice. Little did they know, their nightmare was not over. They were about to add another victim to their bloody tally. As Brock and West sped away from the darkened woods of Chattooga County on the night of December 12, 1982, news of the murders had not yet reached anyone. The remote location of Corpsewood meant that the bodies of Charles Scudder and Joey Odom would lie undiscovered for days. Meanwhile, the two fugitives drove Dr. Scudder's Jeep across state lines, chain-smoking and nervously planning their next moves. They swapped out the Jeep's distinctive license plate to avoid detection. By the next day, December 13th, they had reached rural Mississippi. Low on fuel and money, the pair decided to ditch the very identifiable black Jeep for another vehicle that would not attract attention. Later that day, the duo pulled into a rest area near Vicksburg, where a lone car sat with a man sleeping inside. The man was Navy Lieutenant Kirby Ken Phelps, age 26, who was on his way home to Georgia for the holidays. Brock and West crept up to Phelps' small Toyota, and in a maneuver as cold-blooded as the Corpsewood attack, they woke the groggy Navy lieutenant at gunpoint and forced him to walk into the woods beside the rest stop. As they prepared to tie him to a tree, Lieutenant Phelps made a desperate attempt to flee. Tony West did not hesitate. He shot the young officer dead, firing multiple bullets into Phelps before he could escape. Brock and West then stole Phelps' wallet, netting only a bit of cash, and his car, abandoning Scudder's Jeep there at the rest stop. The senseless murder of Lieutenant Phelps, a stranger to them, demonstrated that Brock and West were willing to kill anyone who got in their way, even when it was completely unnecessary. It was an act of pure, callous violence that would later horrify the public even more than the initial murders. After switching to Phelps's car, the fugitives continued west for a time, possibly considering heading toward California or Mexico. But tensions were rising between the two accomplices. They had been on the run for days. They were hungry, tired, and growing increasingly distrustful of one another. They argued in Austin, Texas over their next steps, and ended up splitting up around December 17th or 18th. Kenneth Brock, the younger of the two, was cracking under the weight of guilt and fear. He ultimately decided to turn back toward Georgia, perhaps hoping to surrender and blame everything on West. Brock hitchhiked his way east, reaching Georgia by December 20th of 1982. Near Marietta, just outside of Atlanta, he called his mother from a payphone. She informed him that the police were looking for him and that the whole horrific story had started to come out. Brock quickly hung up, resigned to his fate. He walked into a nearby gas station and calmly confessed to the attendant that he was involved in the Corpsewood murders. The clerk kept him talking until law enforcement, who by then had an arrest warrant out for him, arrived within minutes. They then took him into custody without incident. Tony West's journey took a different turn. After parting from Brock in Texas, West meandered through Oklahoma and Missouri, apparently unsure of where to go. On Christmas Eve, 1982, West was in Chattanooga, Tennessee, just a short drive from the Georgia state line, when his stolen car ran out of gas. Exhausted, broke, and desperate, West walked through cold rain into a highway truck stop lounge on the outskirts of Chattanooga. There, he actually approached a uniformed police officer and said, "Go ahead and take me in." West essentially surrendered, confessing on the spot that he was wanted for murders back in Georgia. The officer, startled by this unsolicited confession, checked for warrants, but initially couldn't find one for West in the system, likely due to some administrative delay. Regardless, West refused to leave. He was shivering and exhausted. He clearly wanted to give himself up. So the Tennessee officer detained him and contacted Georgia authorities. By the early hours of Christmas morning, Tony West was handed over to the Chattooga County deputies and formally arrested for the murders of Charles Scudder and Joey Odom. Back on Taylor's Ridge, several days had passed, and nobody had seen or heard from Dr. Scudder or Joey Odom. The first sign of trouble came on December 16th, when a couple of locals noticed something odd at Corpsewood. One neighbor spotted bullet holes riddling the door of the manor and got an uneasy feeling. That same day, Teresa Hudgens could no longer contain her trauma. Having been effectively kept under watch by Joey Wells's family since the night of the murders, Teresa finally managed to reach out to her own family and then the police. Overwhelmed and shaking, the young woman told sheriff's deputies about the horrific events that she had witnessed. With this eyewitness information, Chattooga County Sheriff Gary McConnell and his deputies raced up to Corpsewood Manor on December 16th. Meanwhile, a family friend of Scudder and Odom's, worried after days of silence, also came by the property that day, only to flee in terror after glimpsing the gruesome scene inside and smelling decay in the air. Authorities would describe it as a crime scene unlike any other. The quiet brick home was now a tableau of horror. Investigators found blood-stained walls, overturned furniture, and spent bullet casings strewn about. In the kitchen lay the body of Joseph Odom, collapsed in a pool of his own blood near the stove, with the carcasses of the two large mastiffs at his side. Deeper in the house, Dr. Charles Scudder's body was discovered on the floor, his hands still bound. The violence of his end was obvious. Scudder had been gagged and shot multiple times in the head, and fragments of his shattered eyeglasses and teeth were scattered nearby. Hanging on the wall above him, detectives noted with a shiver, was Scudder's own self-portrait depicting almost an identical scene. Truly a chilling detail that many would consider to be a premonition. Beyond the bloodshed, the contents of the house fascinated and shocked law enforcement. The remote castle was filled with an odd collection of items. These ranged from satanic and occult artwork to ritual daggers, whips and chains, a tiara and a wig, stacks of pornography, and 2 human skulls. Deputies even came across 3 small vials labeled LSD-25, later determined to be old, mostly inactive samples that Scudder had taken from his lab in Chicago years prior. The pink room in the outbuilding, with its mattresses and bondage gear, further confirmed the rumors of the couple's libertine lifestyle. The scene was a detective's nightmare, but a tabloid reporter's dream. Sheriff McConnell wisely summoned the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, or GBI, and state crime lab technicians to meticulously process the site. Evidence was collected, including the rifle and knife left behind by the killers, fingerprints, and the guest logbook, though intriguingly, the infamous guest book of names was reported missing, possibly pilfered as a scandalous keepsake. Word of the double murder of 2 eccentric recluses spread quickly in law enforcement circles, and then to the media. On December 18th of 1982, the Atlanta Constitution ran a headline that captured the sensational tone that would pervade the coverage. Slain devil worshippers were ex-college teacher and companion. The article quoted Sheriff McConnell, who noted, "It is a very bizarre murder. The gentlemen that lived in the house were devil worshippers. We're a very small town, and we had known about that, but that's just freedom of religion." To McConnell's credit, he appeared to recognize that Scudder and Odom's unorthodox beliefs were their own business. But once that detail was out, the press ran with it sensationally. The next day's paper spoke breathlessly of the bizarre killing of 2 reclusive devil worshippers and their homosexual activity, alluding to the whips and unusual sexual devices found at the scene. The salacious details of the skulls, satanic symbols, and paraphernalia were splashed across headlines from Georgia to California as the Associated Press and other outlets picked up the story. Small-town Chattooga County suddenly found itself at the center of a national media frenzy that mixed genuine horror at the crime with a prurient fascination for the victims' lifestyles. Sheriff McConnell, meanwhile, had a triple homicide to solve: Scudder, Odom, and the unknown third victim from the Jeep, who would soon be identified as Lieutenant Phelps. Thanks to Teresa Hudgens' statement and evidence at the scene, warrants were swiftly issued for Kenneth Avery Brock and Tony West on the charges of murder. The abandoned Jeep recovered by police in Mississippi further tied into the case once its Georgia plates were traced back to Corpsewood Manor. With Brock already in custody by December 20th and West captured by the 25th, the manhunt was relatively short-lived but intense. Brock had confessed his role almost immediately upon surrender, providing investigators with a detailed timeline of events. West, after initially trying to blame Brock alone, also gave a full confession of the shootings, including the murder of Lieutenant Phelps, to a GBI agent. "All I can say is they were devils, and I killed them. That's how I feel about it," West said coldly, speaking of Scudder and Odom. By Christmas 1982, the killers were behind bars, and a community was left to grapple with the aftermath. On December 26th, the Atlanta Constitution printed a particularly dramatic summary. Scudder and Odom were described by authorities as homosexual devil worshippers who lived in a dank, castle-like home cluttered with skulls, pornographic materials, and an extensive occult library, along with statues of Satan, serpents, lizards, and frogs. The tone of some coverage verged on vilifying the victims more than the perpetrators, a fact that did not go unnoticed by outside observers. The Church of Satan's founder, Anton LaVey, for instance, expressed anger at the injustice of what happened to them, noting that this case was proof that in parts of America, people could still be persecuted and even killed for being different. Among many locals in Chattooga County, however, there was a conflicted response. Some viewed Brock and West with a degree of grim sympathy, seeing their act as, in their eyes, a cleansing of perceived evil in the community. This dark notion that the murders were justifiable in the eyes of the public would later be remarked upon, underscoring the prejudice that Scudder and Odom had quietly lived among. The legal aftermath of the Corpsewood Manor murders moved quickly. By February of 1983, just 2 months after the killings, the case was on the Chattooga County docket. Facing overwhelming evidence and his own confession, Kenneth Avery Brock accepted a plea deal. On February 15th of 1983, Brock pleaded guilty to his role in the murders, specifically admitting to shooting Joey Odom in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms in prison, 1 for each murder, including Lieutenant Phelps. At 17 years old, Brock would have no chance for parole for decades, effectively spending the rest of his life behind bars. Tony West, however, chose to stand trial. In late February of 1983, West was tried for the murder in a Georgia courtroom, with Judge Joseph Loggins presiding, a judge known for being tough on criminals. The trial lasted about a week and a half, and it was as sensational as expected. West's defense team floated multiple, sometimes contradictory explanations in a bid to avoid a capital conviction. Initially, West claimed that the slayings were an act of revenge on Scudder for supposedly corrupting Brock, essentially saying that Brock had been embarrassed by the sexual encounters with Scudder and that they sought payback. This was a dubious rationale for a robbery murder, and it didn't gain much traction. The defense then shifted tactics, asserting that Dr. Scudder had drugged Brock and West with LSD-laced wine, causing them to hallucinate and go temporarily insane. West even alleged that he saw Scudder's golden harp pulsing with an evil glow, and that the professor had bewitched him somehow. However, forensic tests on the leftover wine found no trace of LSD. Investigators had already learned that while Scudder owned old LSD samples, he hadn't actually dosed anyone that night. The only drugs consumed were voluntary: alcohol, marijuana, and huffed solvents. The prosecution countered with evidence of premeditation. Witnesses and Brock's own statements showed the duo planned the robbery while stone cold sober days beforehand. At one point, West's attorney even resorted to inflaming anti-gay sentiments in the courtroom, making homophobic insinuations about the victims in an attempt to justify the violence. The courtroom drama was intense, but in the end, the facts were clear, and the jury remained unswayed by the defenses. After just 2 hours of deliberation, the jury found Tony West guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to death by electrocution for the murders of Scudder and Odom, and effectively for Lieutenant Phelps as well. For a brief time, it looked like West might face Georgia's electric chair. However, an appeals court later found an issue with the composition of the jury. Reportedly, not enough women jurors were included, among other concerns, and overturned the death sentence on procedural grounds. Rather than face a retrial and the possibility of a new death sentence, West agreed in March of 1985 to a plea deal. He accepted 2 consecutive life sentences plus additional years in exchange for the state dropping the pursuit of execution. Thus, by 1985, both Brock and West were securely in Georgia's prison system for life. In the decades since, neither man has ever been paroled. As of the 40th anniversary of the crime in 2022, Brock, who's 57 years old now, remains incarcerated at a Georgia correctional facility, and West, around age 70, is also still behind bars, each having been denied parole multiple times. The law had done its work, but the court of public opinion was left deeply divided about the case for years. Sheriff McConnell bluntly summed up what he believed were the killer's dual motives. Robbery was probably about 50% of the motive. The rest, likely the devil worshipping and homosexuality. In other words, prejudice and hatred played as much of a role as greed. Tony West's own unapologetic post-conviction statement underscored that ugly truth. They were devils, and I killed them. That's how I feel about it. Such sentiments were made clear that Scudder and Odom were victimized not only by the bullets that killed them, but also by the bigotry that followed them, even in death. With the trials over, the focus turned to what would become of Corpsewood Manor and the property. Neither Scudder nor Odom had surviving partners or spouses, so their families squabbled over their modest estate. Dr. Scudder had willed everything to Joey Odom, but since Odom too was deceased, Scudder's 4 adult sons and Odom's sister each laid claim to the land and what remained of the possessions. A notable legal battle ensued over artifacts like Scudder's harp and the bronze Mephistopheles statue. In 1983, famed Georgia defense attorney Bobby Lee Cook was hired by Scudder's sons and ultimately secured the harp and statue on their behalf. These pieces, curiously, ended up in display in Cook's law office for some time. The 40-acre property itself was sold off relatively soon after the murders, passing into private hands. The new owner did not relish the site's dark notoriety, and trespassers were discouraged. However, Corpsewood Manor did not stand intact for long. In January of 1983, barely a month after the murders, a fire of mysterious origin gutted the 3-story chicken house, destroying the infamous pink room in which the nightmare had begun. Locals suspected that it was arson, perhaps revenge by someone outraged at the devil worship that had allegedly occurred there, or simply vandalism by thrill seekers. Then, in late 1983, another blaze, almost certainly arson as well, burned the main manor house to ruins, consuming the wooden roof, floors, and exterior. The brick walls, sturdy to the end, did not entirely collapse, but the once cozy home was now a blackened shell open to the sky. Over the years, weather and neglect took their toll. Ivy and wild vines crept over the remaining brick arches and walls, and the forest began to reclaim the site. By the 1990s and 2000s, all that was left of Corpsewood Manor were piles of bricks, partial walls, and the skeletal brick pillars of what had been the front gazebo where Scudder and Odom once drank their morning tea. A pair of stone gate pillars that marked the entry to the property still stand, and the foundation outline of the manor is barely visible beneath the vines and fallen leaves. Locals say the ruins exude an eerie calm now, like a tomb sealed off in the woods. The land remains privately owned and is considered off-limits to visitors. But that has not stopped curious souls from making pilgrimages. Hikers, paranormal investigators, and true crime enthusiasts frequently sneak down the overgrown logging road, Dead Horse Road, as Scudder had grimly named it, to glimpse the place where the infamous events occurred. In the wake of the tragedy, the remains of the victims were handled according to their families' wishes. In a small private ceremony at Corpsewood, friends scattered Joey Odom's ashes in his beloved rose garden on the property, granting his wish to forever be a part of the place he loved. Dr. Scudder's body was claimed by his family and returned to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where he was buried in the Scudder family plot by his sister in April 1983. Thus, even in death, the couple were separated. One laid to rest in the soil of Corpsewood, the other returned to his Midwestern roots. For Chattooga County, the Corpsewood Manor case became a cautionary tale told for generations. It highlighted the extreme culture clash between two free-living northern transplants and the insular, religious, rural community they settled in. The words of one commentator: "Two innocent men were brutally murdered, then victimized again for their sexual orientation and religious beliefs." Over time, some measure of re-examination occurred. People began to recognize that Scudder and Odom hurt no one, and that the real evil that visited Taylor's Ridge that night was not satanic at all, but rather human greed and intolerance. The site, however, would never escape the shadow of its dark lore, evolving into a local legend of a haunted place. Almost immediately after the murders, tales of paranormal activity at Corpsewood Manor began to circulate. Even the sheriff's deputies and GBI agents who processed the crime scene felt an uncanny vibe. Some officers later said that they felt as if they were being watched in the empty woods, or sensed a strange presence as they worked the case. Given the occult trappings of the house, it's perhaps not surprising that imaginations ran wild. Locals, already primed with rumors of devil worship and black magic, soon began spinning ghost stories about Taylor's Ridge. One persistent legend warns that anyone who takes a brick or artifact from the ruins will suffer horrible bad luck or a curse. This lore may have been started because several people who grabbed souvenirs from Corpsewood reported sudden misfortunes and became convinced that the objects were cursed. There is the story of a young man who stole a decorative brick from the rubble, only to experience a string of personal disasters until he returned it. Whether by coincidence or psychological suggestion, the cursed brick tale endures. Many refuse to disturb anything at the site for fear of angering restless spirits. Visitors to the ruins over the years frequently describe eerie sights and sounds. There are reports of shadowy figures fitting between the trees and apparitions believed to resemble Charles Scudder or Joey Odom wandering the grounds. Some have claimed to smell roses, perhaps Odom's garden, or whiffs of pipe tobacco with no logical source. Auditory phenomena are especially common in these tales. Many have reported hearing the distant echo of gunshots in the woods, as if replaying the violence of that night. Others swear they've heard the fierce barking of dogs when no dogs are present. Perhaps the loyal mastiffs still guarding their masters, even in death. One chilling account even describes the tinkling sound of a harp playing a melancholy tune from somewhere among the ruins, despite no instrument being there. Campers who have snuck onto the property at night tell of an oppressive silence falling, then the sudden shatter of unseen glass, or a guttural scream that sends them fleeing. After nightfall, multiple witnesses have reported seeing pairs of glowing red eyes in the forest darkness, eyes that some believe belong to the spectral mastiff Beelzebub, still standing watch with preternatural ferocity. Local folklore has also grafted older legends onto the Corpsewood story. Some say the area was haunted even before Scudder and Odom arrived. Tales of a Civil War soldier's ghost roaming the ridge, or curses tied to the Cherokee who once lived on that land. These unrelated legends sometimes get mixed in with the Corpsewood narrative during retellings, creating a kind of legend stew. However, the ghost stories specific to the murders are the ones most often repeated around campfires and teenage sleepovers in the region. The site is so notorious that among local youth, it earned nicknames like Devil Worshippers Mountain. Parents would warn their kids to stay away, and indeed, some who ventured up Dead Horse Road recounted scary encounters. In one case, a group of visitors claimed they were chased off by unknown men brandishing machetes and guns, leading to whispers that either violent squatters or some secretive cult now guards the ruins. Over the years, paranormal investigators and occult enthusiasts have been drawn to Corpsewood. Some self-proclaimed witches have held midnight rituals among the crumbling walls, attempting to communicate with the dead or to conjure ghosts out of tragedy. Ghost hunting groups who visit often come away convinced that the site is a hotspot of supernatural energy, citing their EVP recordings of disembodied voices or inexplicable EMF spikes. One paranormal author even noted that after researching the case thoroughly, the combination of the gruesome murder scene and creepy, isolated ruins was so chilling that it kept him from sleeping without the lights on after he visited. And yet, for all the spooky lore, there is a rational perspective that tempers the legend. Skeptics point out that any cold spots or odd noises at Corpsewood can easily be attributed to the natural environment, the scurrying of animals, or the echo of distant hunters' gunfire in these deep woods. As one journalist wrote after visiting the overgrown site, storytellers imbue Corpsewood with a demonic energy, but the only thing that remains here is an expired crime scene. Indeed, walking among the graffiti-marked bricks and tangled brush, one may simply feel a profound sadness more than any malevolent force. It is as if the land itself remembers the blood spilled and mourns the senseless loss of life. One tantalizing paranormal footnote often discussed is Dr. Scudder's own role in what many see as him foretelling his own fate. The fact that he painted a portrait of himself bound and shot before it happened has led to much speculation. Did Scudder have a genuine psychic premonition? Or was it a morbid artistic fantasy that coincidentally came true? We may never know. It's said that in the weeks leading up to his death, Scudder told a friend that he had finally achieved peace on his mountain and that life was perfect, almost tempting fate. He also famously said that out in the country, I asked for this after all, which he then eerily repeated under duress during the attack. Such details feed the idea that dark forces were circling. However, a more grounded interpretation is that Scudder, a devotee of the occult, perhaps accepted the possibility of violence as karma or consequence for his choices, like moving to an intolerant area or fraternizing with unstable people. It is an area where fact and myth blur, leaving ample material for ghost stories and what-ifs. Local storytellers have been shy about layering on embellishments. In dorm rooms and campgrounds, Corpsewood tale is told in hushed tones, how the two Satanist gay lovers allegedly made a pact with the devil, or how one of them supposedly uttered a curse with his dying breath that haunts the mountain. These are folkloric additions. There's no evidence of an actual curse. Yet the string of misfortunes that befell the perpetrators right after, crashing the car, fighting each other, and getting caught, sometimes gets spun as the curse of Corpsewood, ensured that they didn't escape justice. In reality, those events were the logical fallout of a botched crime spree, but the timing certainly makes for a good ghost story. In the end, Corpsewood Manor has achieved a kind of infamous immortality. It stands alongside other eerie southern legends, a place where true crime and the supernatural intersect in popular imagination. For those inclined to believe, the ghosts of Charles Scudder and Joey Odom do roam the ruins, perhaps playing phantom harp music under the moonlight, or staring out from the trees with sorrowful eyes. For others, the power of the site lies in its symbolism, as a reminder of how prejudice and fear of the other can lead to real evil acts. And one thing is certain: anyone who visits the remnants of Corpsewood Manor today will find it hard to not feel a chill, whether that is the chill of the mountain air or the whispers of restless spirits is for each person to decide. Thank you guys so much for watching this newest episode. I've been working on researching Corpsewood Manor and the events surrounding it for a few months now, and I hope you enjoyed the final product. Please subscribe, like the video, comment below, and share this around. Please check out the Ghost in Me podcast and consider becoming a channel member by clicking join now or by visiting patreon.com/mysteryarchives for all my content ad-free. I also sell my 3 published books, the Stories from the Archives series, on my website, along with other merchandise, or you can find it on Amazon. With all that being said, I truly hope that you enjoyed this blend of true crime and paranormal. And as always, this has been Cody here at Mystery Archives. Please, make sure to stay safe out there, and take care. I'll see you next time.